Like I was saying, this topic is one that is so vast and so deep and so multivariate and multifaceted that I was really hesitant to talk about it. One, so there's two things I want to say to start, which is one, the reason that I was hesitant to talk about it is that oftentimes, as soon as one starts talking about virtue or ethics or morality, it's assumed that they are giving themselves um, license or permission to assume that they're already established in integrity or justice or righteousness or whatever we're talking about in terms of virtue. And that's a little bit of a dangerous ground because it immediately can create polarization with people when you have the conversation. And I think that's one of the reasons, maybe the deeper reason, that, of course, at dinner parties, we're not supposed to talk about politics and religion, right? And part of it isn't just that talking about religion or politics is divisive and contentious. Part of it is that it's quite triggering. If one starts talking about virtue or some aspect of virtue, it can be triggering for people because what arises in the ego is, who's this person? I'm sure they've got all sorts of problems and shortcomings and weaknesses, and I'm sure they have shadow material that's unresolved and things that they do that are um, less than virtuous. And I just wanted to share some of that because I am not making any claims to virtue for myself personally. The one thing I can say, and this is something that I invite as an idea for those of you who are interested in this topic, is that this idea of perfection or of being ethically perfect or from a place of behavior or even at the level of mind of being impeccable um, is impossible because we're human, and there's this tendency of people to beat themselves up. I went to a Jesuit all boys high school and a Jesuit university, and we talk about Catholic guilt, right? This idea of being sinful or and what does that even mean is something that's pretty pervasive, and it took me a lot of years of work to even get rid of the idea um, of letting go of that idea. And what's kind of ironic about it, and most of this talk is not about religion, but what's ironic about it is that the core teaching of Jesus is forgiveness. His last words on the cross were, "Forgive them, fathers, for they know not what they do." The core message of Jesus' teachings is forgive others, right? But ironically, so many people raised with an ethical or a moral system that's rooted in Christianity carry this heavy, burdensome guilt all the time. So I think there's kind of a core irony there. And again, I don't want to have this conversation turn into one about religion. I will talk about it a little bit. But I think that it's really important that we are incredibly forgiving towards ourselves and accepting as a foundation for developing and cultivating virtue in our lives. And so that's the first thing I wanted to say. The second thing was that I think in some ways the beginning point or the most important virtue is integrity. And the reason being that we have to first be willing to be honest with ourselves about where we're at in order to even begin down a path of cultivating virtue. And when I say cultivating virtue, I mean that in the Taoist sense, which I'll talk more about a little bit later. But the ego's primary mode of operation is to create separation between ourselves and others, separation between ourselves and the moment by constantly obsessing over the future and the past, separation in all of its endless forms. That's what allows the ego to, it's what it feeds on, and what allows the ego to thrive is this feeling of separation. And as a result, it's very clever in disallowing us from seeing ourselves really clearly, which is really at the root of integrity. And so seeing ourselves clearly allows us to start to come to terms with shadow material, habits, weaknesses, tendencies, the things that we do that at a most basic level, at a practical level, undermine our vital force, our vitality, or what in Taoist medicine we call your qi, your vital energy. And furthermore, if the vital energy is not intact, then one's spirit or the shen becomes dimmer. It doesn't have the same luminosity and brightness. So the first step to any kind of cultivation of virtue is to be in integrity with oneself, to find the places that we're out of integrity, and then to be forgiving, to be accepting of where we're at. So that's kind of at an interpersonal level or a personal level. And what I'm wanting to talk about more is a little bit more conceptual. And then I'm going to talk about why the conceptual approach to virtue is not particularly helpful. What's really helpful is a practical approach to virtue. So I wanted to just kind of open this with that little conversation about integrity, because I want to mention that these talks that I'm sharing are part of the Way of Tea. And the way I've structured the Way of Tea is from the innermost cultivation to the outermost expression. And so it starts with meditation. The second is virtue, which arises out of meditation and some of the practices in the Way of Tea. The third is vitality, and that has to do with health, the cultivation of really true, vital, resilient health. There's something that we have in the healing arts called the healing or the healing threshold, and above that threshold, you are far less susceptible to disease or degradation or to disharmony. Below that threshold, you're much more susceptible. So a lot of what we do in Chinese medicine is we try to strengthen the vital systems and to harmonize the whole body and mind and the whole system so that we are above a certain threshold. So we're less susceptible. And that is at the level of mind, at the level of emotions, it's at the level of the physical health, the physiology, the organs. And so for vitality, that involves diet and sleep and habits and vices and a number of things, which we'll talk more about later. And the fourth is tradition. And in our tradition, we have Taoism, Zen Buddhism, some shamanic aspects of shamanic practice, and then reverence for nature itself, because all of these teachings ultimately come back to observing nature and appreciating nature. And then out of those traditions, we have methodology. Methodology is the fifth pillar, and there's two aspects. One is methodology around tea production. So how is green tea produced and red tea, and what's the difference, and how do those influence how we feel when we drink those teas? So it actually has to do with tea production. And the other aspect of methodology is the brewing methods. So we have 9 brewing methods in our whole lineage. And we have 3 core brewing methods that we work with very regularly. So as I teach these courses, I'll be going through all of those. And you can find now up on the website, I've done one for leaves in a bowl and side handle and kind of gone through all the steps if you're curious and you want to explore that. And then the final is community. And that has an esoteric side of it, and then it also has a practical side of it. Almost everything in the Way of Tea, which you learn over time, has an inner meaning or an esoteric, a hidden meaning, and also a practical external meaning. And so in community, there's the practical meaning, which is that if we're not sharing tea with people, in some ways it's a self-absorbed practice, which is contrary to the Way of Tea. And I know a lot of people who just drink tea by themselves in the morning, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's not a judgment call. It's just to say that there's so much joy. It's such a beautiful, heartfelt offering and gift to share tea, and it facilitates authentic communication and intimacy better than anything else that I've found, truthfully. So building community, and it's also, tea is called the Great Connector in Mandarin. It really helps facilitate growing and building community. I've seen it break down divisive walls and bring people together. We have a wonderful saying in our tradition, which is, if you bring, a Hindu and a Jewish person and a Catholic into a room and you debate religion, they'll all come out enemies, or at least in disagreement about core aspects of life. If you bring those three people together into a room and they all drink tea together and they discuss tea and their experience, and they allow the tea to open them and open their hearts, they'll all walk out as friends. And, that's a little bit exaggerated, but it's also really true. I know so many people who might not otherwise have found the space to connect, or the social awkwardness of being a human with an ego would have prevented them from connecting. Where if they sit and connect around tea, they bond on a deeper level. That's kind of some of the magic of tea, aside from it as a medicinal herb, or what we call a spirit tonic, a shen tonic, is its ability to break down identity, and allow people to see each other from a more essential place. It's extraordinarily profound at doing that. So that's kind of the practical level of community. And then at the more esoteric level, it's this idea that in a path of growth, or a path of wisdom, or a path of self-cultivation and development, as we progress, we'll say up some steps. You can't progress until the next step until you bring somebody up to the step that you're on. And you find this concept in a number of different spiritual traditions. The one that I found that has spoken the most clearly about it, that's elucidated the concept, is in the Gurdjieff work. Gurdjieff was a Russian mystic and profound teacher who lived in, he was born kind of on the Russian-Eurasian border and died, I think, in 1959. And I've studied a lot of his teachings, but there's a very clear idea that you can't move to the next step in your own development until you bring somebody up to the step that you're on. So we have in all the traditions the roles of the adepts, people who have moved forward in the tradition, and then the role of initiates, or people who are students, or who are growing and learning and introducing themselves to a tradition. So that's also part of community. So historically, we would have had schools, right? We had schools of developmental schools. We don't have that as much nowadays, but they still exist. And in our lineage, in our tradition, we very strongly feel that we want to share. We want people to have access to these beautiful teachings. And we want it to be open, to be accessible, but we also want to protect the beauty and the integrity and the lineage, the tradition behind this tradition, which is a little bit tricky. And this is to finish my long-winded introduction about integrity. Because protecting the integrity, there are a lot of people who, as most of you know, I have a tea business, obviously. A lot of people come and they buy a bunch of stuff, and they come to one tea ceremony, and then they go out and they start brewing everything however they want, and talking about things however they want, and finding information on the internet. There is so much misinformation on the internet about tea, it's kind of crazy. And it's not to say that there's something wrong with any of that. It's that for me, as somebody who is a holder in this lineage, it's really important to honor where a lot of the teachings came from for me. Which is through Wuda and Master Lin, and some other teachers in Taiwan. But a lot of the things I'm sharing were passed on. I didn't just arrive at these sitting and drinking tea. And the 6 pillars, which I just kind of went through a little bit, those pillars are my own distillation of the teachings that I've received. And the reason that I've described them that way with the 6 pillars is because for me, my mind needed a clear path of development, so I could really consistently work on different aspects of what it means to study tea as a way of life. So I just want to be clear that the pillars are not a capital P pillar. It is my own interpretation, which I've discussed with my teachers, that helps me facilitate teaching for other people. But they aren't coming out of a tradition or a lineage of these are the 6 pillars of the way of tea, and that it's been codified and engraved on some cliff somewhere in China. It's my own, they are my own understanding of what makes it a linear way. And as I mentioned in other talks, distilling any Taoist or Buddhist teaching into a linear path of that first you do this, and then this happens, and then you do that, and this happens, and then this, they would all say that is absolute rubbish, throw it out. These are cyclical teachings. They work in spirals. Even when you think you understand something because you've heard it before, the 10th time, I've heard a lot of the stories out of our tradition, like more times than any person should be subjective to listening to a story. and but all of a sudden, the 10th time I hear it, on a retreat somewhere, whatever, it unlocks a totally different understanding about the way of tea or some aspect of tea practice. So part of my being in integrity, if I'm going to talk about virtue, is to just share with you these 6 pillars are my understanding, and I'm approaching them with as much reverence for the tradition and lineage that I've learned from, in sharing them with you or talking about them openly or publicly like this. So that may have been an unnecessary disclaimer, but that's my disclaimer for the talk. Okay, so I want to share a quote just to kind of introduce this, and it's really at the heart of this concept of integrity for me, because something that I realized in clinical practice with Chinese medicine was that so many people, when I pushed them with some difficult questions, and this was an approach that I kind of learned through studying a teacher named Lineage, who's written some unbelievably profound books on traditional Chinese medicine, to push people a little bit on why are they here? Why are they coming for healing, for acupuncture or herbalism or whatever? What is their intention? Why are they... when you ask somebody, what do you want? And they say, well, I don't know, I've got a bum shoulder and it's kind of achy. And you go, no, what do you want? What do you want in life? What are you using your precious life energy for in this short time that you have here? You have such a limited time, and we only have so much energy. And so asking a person the question, what do you want truly, deeply? Most people haven't really answered that question for themselves because it's a difficult question to answer. And oftentimes, even when we do answer the question, it changes. There are levels and layers of that. Okay, why do you want that? Is it from conditioning and identification? Is it because your uncle was always, everybody in the family always talked about your uncle in a certain way and he was very successful and you saw that was what would gain adulation and attention? Was it because you were neglected as a child and so you wanted attention, so you were pursuing things in life that gain you more attention? Whatever it might be, it's to start to break down layers of identification with who we think we are to arrive at a core essential sense of what is it I truly want. And there's a term in Taoist medicine called Ming or Shen Ming. And Ming is a concept that we have a contract with heaven, which if that's too far out or esoteric for you, that's fine. You don't have to use a different word for heaven. We have a contract with our life, with our essential nature, with our unique constitutional makeup. And that contract with heaven, the idea is that we are all endowed with a unique genetic makeup, our Jing. And this unique genetic makeup makes us the way that we are. Every one of us is totally unique. And we're a combination of our conditioning and our experiences, along with this kind of blueprint. We have a blueprint of who we are. And the more deeply we can understand our constitutional makeup, our blueprint, and also our conditioning and the way that conditioning has affected us psychologically, emotionally, spiritually, the more we can bring those things together. which is not a purely intellectual process. It's really about taking a lot of layers of identity off. The closer we can come to this concept of Ming, or in the Western world, we call it purpose, right? What is our purpose? I mention this because when I ask a lot of people in clinical practice or when I work with people one-on-one, and I really try to dig in with them, what do you want in life? What do you really want? Not what do you want to get? What do you want to amass? How do you want to appear? But what do you truly want? A lot of folks have a very difficult time answering that question. And it's a difficult question to answer. It takes incredible levels of integrity with oneself and authenticity to really get into it. And when you come to terms with what you really want, then you have to come up against all the reasons that you're not willing to go and pursue what you want, which is another thing, right? What are the obstacles, and why do you prevent yourself from overcoming those obstacles? So that is a beginning of a starting point of a conversation around virtue. And so I want to share this quote because it's a very beautiful quote. And the basic essence of the quote is, we don't know ourselves. So how can you answer the question, what do you want, if you don't really know yourself? And so here's the quote. Man or woman, man remains a mystery to himself. He has a nostalgia for being, a longing for duration, for permanence, for absoluteness, a longing to be. Yet everything that constitutes his life is temporary, ephemeral, and limited. He aspires to another order, another life, a world that is beyond him. He senses that he is meant to participate in it, in this other world. He searches for an idea, an inspiration that could move him in this direction. It arises as a question, who am I? Who am I in this world? If this question becomes sufficiently alive, it could direct the course of his life. But he cannot answer. He has nothing with which to answer. No knowledge of himself to face this question. No knowledge of his own. But he feels he must welcome it. He asks himself what he is. This is the first step on the way. He wants to open his eyes. He wants to wake up, to awaken. So this concept of awakening is central to every spiritual teaching, and it is central to this concept of virtue. And if we wish to know who and what we are, we must have a path of development. There must be a way to develop ourselves and to grow, to come more deeply in touch with this question, who am I in this world? And we have to have material knowledge, real knowledge, objective knowledge of ourselves and who we are in order to start to wake up from the dream of who we are not. This path of development, this path of discovering really who we are, really what we want and what we are, that path of development begins with a foundation of virtue. Without a foundation of virtue, we don't have a starting point. So people think that a spiritual path or a path of, the word spiritual is quite loaded. If that doesn't work for you, then you can use a different word. Personal development, we'll call it. People think that we have a spiritual path so that we can get to a place of being more virtuous or more whole or more awake. But that's a little bit backwards, because the beginning of a path of development or the beginning of a spiritual path is to have a foundation of virtue. We have to have virtue as a foundation for our development. So we have this wonderful saying in our tradition, and I really like it a lot. And the saying that we try to live by in this tradition of tea, the way of tea, is, Buddha even has this engraved over his bed in Taiwan. In every breath, in every step, from the moment I awake until the moment I sleep, I am preparing tea. And I remember the first time I heard it, I was like, what the hell does that mean? And the idea is that, again, when I was describing the 6 pillars, that starts to affect every aspect of your life. The way that you eat, your diet, movement of the body, sleep, meditation, the harmony of your relationships, your integrity, the virtue with which you live your lives, which, if you don't want to use the word virtue, let's use the word goodness. The goodness with which you live your life, your integrity, this wish to know who you are, this wish to understand who am I in this world and really aspire towards it. And also, like I said earlier, this idea of perfection is a false idea, but we can have a deep care. We can say, I care about living with integrity, authenticity, and goodness. That commitment to care and having a genuine care, taking interest in it, all of those things are the way of tea. It's not just, can I brew tea well and serve it to people? So in that way, it really affects the way that you live every aspect of your life. And that's why we say, from the moment I wake until the moment I sleep, I am preparing tea. And it just so happens that the people who I've drank tea with, who brew tea that I walk away from the session feeling like, I think my life has been changed by that tea session. Like, I don't know what the hell just happened. That's touched on something deeply essential. It hasn't touched me at the level of personality or at the level of knowledge. It's touched on something core, something essential about who I am, and opened a window and door that allows me to see myself more clearly and to get into touch with myself more clearly. The transmission is coming not because they understand water temperature and leaf amount and have really nice teaware. The transmission is coming because they are living in the way of tea with extraordinary authenticity and integrity, which means that they are following these principles. They're living a life of tea. They're cultivating virtue and goodness and honesty and transparency. And all of that is going into the tea. And when people who are cultivating themselves at that level are sharing tea, something starts to transmit. And so we have in Zen Buddhism, when a student moves to a level where they've not just taken initiation and precepts, but they've received transmission, which means they can now teach Zen Buddhist teachings to other students. The transmission is the master brews Japanese whiskey and serves it to them. It's a silent transmission. There are no words. And it's the teacher's way of communicating to the student, I see where you have arrived at in your own development and growth. You're now ready to teach. And so that is beyond words. It's a deeper communication. But the symbolism of the teacher and the student, that the passing on of the lineage is done in silence by brewing tea and sharing it, is symbolic. It's central to Zen practice. So the next kind of thing I want to talk about, and then I want to open it up to conversation, is, there's so many different approaches to virtue and ethics and morality and how you behave throughout history. And the difference for me, this question has been very interesting to me. How am I supposed to behave in life? The difference in simplified terms is whether they come from the outside in or from the inside out. And are they in support of, so when we're talking about an ethical code or a code of virtue, are they in support of awakening and freedom, or are they in support of societal order and control? And you could ask yourself that question in that exploration. So to help kind of distinguish between those two things, I want to just look at a couple different approaches to ethics historically. And going all the way back to the ancient Greeks, because they're the first, quote, kind of Western culture that went really deep into this idea of ethics. What are ethics and virtue? And what is the difference between the two? There was a fundamental conversation between Aristotle and Socrates in that dichotomy of teachings. And about the two, and Aristotle developed something called virtue ethics. And the virtue ethics were actually a relic of Egyptian and Hermetic practices and virtue, which were part of a path of spiritual cultivation. So we have at Delphi, the oracle at Delphi, the words on the door above where you enter the oracle they said, Gnosis seautu, which is know thyself. They were essential to any path of knowledge, of true knowledge and wisdom. The path of wisdom, or Sophia, was this concept of knowing oneself, which goes back to the beginning quote here, of really coming into touch with who and what you are, and then living that, being true to yourself, and really knowing who you are. So it's not being true to the ideas you think of who you are, but actually being true to who you truly are. And that was a path of wisdom, coming to know oneself. And so Aristotle had a concept of virtue ethics, which said that something isn't right or wrong based on some moral code of it's sinful or it's virtuous, but rather, does the action lend itself to the cultivation of greater virtue in the person? And so, for example, there might be a condition where not omitting some information to protect somebody, that might be perfectly acceptable. It wasn't based on an ethical code. The question was, does telling the truth or omitting something lend itself to the cultivation of honesty or integrity in myself or not? So that the Greek code of virtue is closer to the Taoist ideas about virtue. And actually the Greeks took it from the Egyptians, that's a whole historical thing that happened. But sadly, in 379 AD under Emperor Theodosius, the libraries at Alexandria were burned. And a lot of the old Egyptian and Hermetic teachings, which were a path of spiritual cultivation, were lost in that. And there were some texts that made it out, one called the Poimandres and the other the Emperor's the Emerald Tablet, which are the basis of Hermetic spiritual practices. But a lot of the Christian influence, after the wiping out of the libraries at Alexandria and during the Christian Crusades, were to shut down the Gnostic earth-based spiritual systems throughout Europe and other parts of the world. And when that happened, we lost a lot of the technology. I'm going to call it like naturalistic biotechnology of learning from nature and studying ourselves and developing a path of cultivation. At that time, a lot of the practices of cultivating virtue were replaced with codes, and this is over history, right? Codes of morality, which were imposed on people. So, the 10 Commandments, or this concept of sin, that if you do something wrong, then you'll go to hell. And that you find that in all the different religions. And the issue with that is then people are trying to behave a certain way based on fear, or based on control, or based on what may or may not happen to them after they die. As opposed to so it's how they ought to act, as opposed to actually wanting to be good, or actually being good, actually being altruistic, or caring for people, or being charitable, or kind, or prudent, or modest, or humble, instead of actually developing those virtues for their own ends. People started to develop moral systems based on fears of what might happen to them when they die, or how people might perceive them socially. And unfortunately, that takes us further and further away from getting in touch with who we really are. It's another layer of how you should behave. But how all of us know people who appear one way in public, but then if you know them personally, they're total assholes. Sorry for my language. But, or we've probably been in relationships where people when they're with your friends, they seem like the kindest, most charming people imaginable. But the minute you get home, it's complaining and negativity and blah, blah, blah. And they take it out on you, right? So this idea of morality or behaving a certain way because you're ought to, because that's how you're supposed to appear, is not authentic. It's not true to the cultivation of actual virtue. So there are so many different ideas about ethics and morality throughout history. The reference to the Greeks is just one of them. Another one, which was a big step forward in the history of philosophical discourse in the West, was Immanuel Kant, which had his ideas around deontological ethics had influence on a lot of other people after him, like Rene Descartes and Hume and Bentham later, a lot of different concepts. The idea of deontological ethics is that there is a black and white, right and wrong, right? You are honest all the time. You do not lie ever, even if the consequences are that people get hurt or terrible things happen. Kant was really pretty clearly black and white. And again, this is a simplification because if we wanted to go deep into Immanuel Kant's idea of ethics, we'd be here for weeks, and I'm not qualified to do that. So we'll have to bring in another teacher for that topic. But this idea of deontological ethics is that the consequences of the actions, it is not a consequentialist philosophy of ethics. It's that there is a black and white, and Kant believed we have a conscience, which we do, which we have an innate knowing of what is right and what is wrong. We always do it as right, and we never do it as wrong, period. Now, that in theory is wonderful, but again, we run into the problem of most people are operating from a socially imposed idea of morality. So it's impossible to always be righteous, or it's impossible to always be in integrity. It's impossible to always be kind or selfless. And so it becomes very, very rigid and inflexible. And the technology is not there for us to cultivate the virtue so that more of the time we're kind, more of the time we're in integrity. And so again, it's an outside-in approach for me. This is again my interpretation of all of this. Another important kind of modern turn of the century, early 1900s, late 1800s thinker was Jeremy Bentham. He had an approach called utilitarianism, which is a consequentialist philosophy. Utilitarianism is the idea that he worked with the pleasure principle, the greatest amount of pleasure for the most amount of people and the least amount of pain, which we could deconstruct that. There's a lot of issues with that approach, but again, it's looking towards what are the consequences of the actions. It's an externalization of what happens if you do this, and does it create more pleasure, which pursuing pleasure ultimately does not lead to real fulfillment, happiness, or the cultivation of virtue. I think people understand that intuitively, but you can also think about it if you want. And then we have some of the modern American philosophers like William James and Charles Peirce, and they developed pragmatism. And pragmatism is the idea that if something has beneficial practical outcomes, practical value, then it is good. It is righteous. It is ethical. If it does not have good practical outward value, then it is not ethical. Again, this is a bit of a simplification because these are quite complex concepts. There's a book called Pragmatism that William James wrote that's beautiful and it's profound. I like William James's approach because he also had a spiritual background. He wrote a book called The Varieties of Religious Experience, where he was interested in mystical states, meditation, virtue, etc. And he kind of wedded that with an American practical approach. What is practically useful? And this is kind of a philosophical approach that seeks to define truth and resolve metaphysical issues together. And a lot of William James' ideas became the foundation for psychology. And psychology, up until that point, and including William James, also included the study of human potentiality. What could we become? Where might we go? And unfortunately, over time, I think William James died in like 1910 or 1905. Since then, psychology has become really a lot about just analyzing problems, psychoanalyzing problems, and then talking about them ad infinitum. It's not really rooted in the idea of what might we become. So, as you can see, these different approaches to ethics and morality are complex. And again, I think what's the takeaway from one's own personal development is first asking questions: who am I? What might I become? And what is my real code of ethical behavior? Do I actually feel kind, contented, harmonious, altruistic, giving, and integrity, connected to who I am and living in alignment with who I am? Do I know myself? Or am I behaving in a certain way because I think that's how you're supposed to behave? Just that inquiry can yield so much insight into what it means to live an authentic life. And the one thing I will say that is the through line of all these different traditions and practices and teachers and ideas, from Kant to Bentham to Taoist teachings and Buddhist teachings, the one consistent through line is this fundamental question: what does it mean to live an authentic life? And asking ourselves that question and pursuing that question is the path of fulfillment and I think happiness and contentedness in life. It's a fundamental question. If your life is limited, you don't know what happens after you die or where you came from before, or maybe you do, then what does it mean in this life to live a truly authentic life? And to live that life without apologies or without conflict, without guilt. And I don't mean that in some like, we have this like machismo woke culture where it's like, I'll never apologize to anybody. I am who I am. Da da da. Be yourself, right? I am saying on one hand, yes, be yourself, be authentic to who you are. But first, one has to really know who they are in order to be that. And the issue is that a lot of people are, quote, being themselves and being loud and proud about it without actually being connected to the true authentic depth of what that really means. So it's about an identity instead of an essential, an essence, the essence of who they are. So this is the last thing that I want to share about this concept, which is the approach to virtue from a Taoist perspective. And the approach to virtue from a Taoist perspective is important in the context of the way of tea because the Taoists related to tea as a medicinal herb and a healing herb, and an herb to help get in touch with one's heart, to quiet the mind and go beneath the level of mind, and to get into the Shen, to bring the Shen down into the heart and really live from a place of the spirit. And they felt the tea was a great supporter of that. There's this beautiful description of tea as a Shen tonic in the earliest Chinese pharmacopoeias, the earliest books of Chinese herbs, where it's the only function was to brighten the eyes. And this concept of brightening the eyes was, the idea was the spiritual eyes, the eyes that can see one's path, the eyes that see one's purpose, one's Ming, like we talked about earlier. That in drinking tea and quieting the mind and opening the heart and going deep into the yin matrix of the body, into the body, that the Shen or the spirit in Taoism is described as a wild, precious bird. And this concept, if you think of a wild, precious bird that wants to fly back to heaven, they say it's pure yang. And that yang is movement. And that if one can be still, if one can be quiet and still, the emotions are still and balanced and centered, the mind is quiet, and one is rooted in the body, then this wild, precious, heavenly bird is attracted down into the heart. And when it's in the heart, we say somebody is with Shen. So when we diagnose the Shen or the spirit in Chinese medicine, we see it in the luminosity of the eyes and the steadiness of the eyes. So when you make eye contact with somebody, and this is a way to check in with yourself to know if you're present. When you're with somebody, can you hold eye contact? Can you feel steady and grounded and present? And the same thing for them. If there's something to hide, if there's something you're ashamed about, if you're not clear, if your heart is not clear, or you feel guilty, or there's something in the relationship that needs to be addressed and talked about, then we avert our eyes. We can't hold steady eye contact. And, there's a healthy version of that. I lived in Los Angeles for years, and it was like everybody was trying to prove how woke they were. So they'd like want to stare at you in the eye for like 10 minutes. And you're like, just stop. I get it. You're totally present. Like, okay, like, cool, So that's not what I'm talking about. It's not about pretending to be totally, totally present right now, man. It's about actually, actually being connected to your body in the moment and being really with somebody and listening deeply. So I mean it more in the sense that Thich Nhat Hanh talks about it, which is deep listening. Can you listen without filters? Can you listen without your own mental talking? And can you listen without thinking, what are you going to say next? Or what experience have you had like that? Can you listen? And this is at the root of virtue, actually. Can you listen from a place of, when the person's done talking, you could repeat back to them verbatim what they said. And they'd go, whoa, you were really actually present with what I said. That is also what it means to that is a profound gift to give somebody, to listen. And it's one of the reasons that tea is such a great connector, because over tea, you can really connect on that level in a very deep way. It facilitates it in a powerful way. So from a Taoist perspective, this idea of virtue is a path of cultivation. It's not that either you are virtuous or you're not virtuous, or sometimes you are or sometimes you aren't. It's the recognition that cultivating virtue is an active practice. From the Taoist perspective, virtue should be practiced in a secret way as a silent path. One of my Taoist teachers, said to me, nobody should ever know that you're working. And what she meant was working on myself. Nobody should ever know. And in that particular tradition, the idea of working meant that part of my attention was always reserved for observing my body, my sensations, my emotions, and my mind. So that I would be having an interaction with somebody, but I'm also trying to observe my inner life while being present with the person, which is extraordinarily difficult because the mind gets distracted so easily and we're always wandering off in thought everywhere. And so when she said working, what she meant was working internally, trying to observe my inner life. She said, nobody should ever know you're working. It should be invisible and silent. And I didn't understand it when she said it. But what I came to understand later was we don't work on ourselves so other people can go, wow, look how spiritually evolved that person is. Wow, look how pious. And like so many people, that's what spirituality is about, is like, I wear mala beads and I do this thing and I do that thing. And there's nothing wrong with wearing mala beads. I use mala beads to chant. But the idea of using these things, trying on spirituality, trying on virtue as an adornment, as a costume, takes us further and further away from what it means to practice. And I often say, other people who have come to talks have probably heard me say, a person of the world puts something on every day. A person of the Tao takes something off. So the practice of cultivating virtue is really about stripping down ideas of who we think we are and coming more deeply into modesty and humility. So virtue should be practiced in a secret way as a silent path. This is a concept that you are not developing your goodness so that people can acknowledge it. You're developing your goodness so that you can be good. which should seem obvious, but it's actually not totally obvious. Otherwise, one might turn virtue into something superficial and thus not be benefited by one's practices. The cultivation of virtue is a deep inner work. It is not a superficial practice. By taking credit for virtuous actions, this is a very Taoist concept. By taking credit for virtuous actions, the mind is easily disturbed and the ego becomes inflated. So in the Tao Te Ching, there are these passages of a person of the Tao does good acts and then disappears before anybody knows who did it, right? Um, that is true goodness. That's the true cultivation of virtue. Doing something to help somebody that they'll never know that you were the one who did it. Examples of this behavior of taking credit for virtuous actions are apparent in situations of worldly conflict. So when we look back at a lot of the wars, a lot of conflict for individuals interpersonally, but also collectively, a lot of that is about one group thinking they're right and virtuous, and another group thinking they're right and virtuous, and wanting to take credit for it, and then it escalating to the point of war in a lot of cases. There's a saying, beware the religious man, right? At a certain extreme, when people take religion too seriously, they start flying planes into buildings and launching children's crusades and sending 14-year-old boys off to war. That kind of insanity is rooted in, quote, virtuosity. So taken to an extreme, when it's an externalization of virtue, it's not only unskillful, but it's dangerous at a collective level, at a larger level. So again, this idea, it's a secret path, it's a secret way and a silent path, is really for your own cultivation and development. The real foundation for virtue is more fundamental than some lofty spiritual practice. This is the last concept I want to end on. And it's also a wonderfully Zen, in that Zen is really practical. It's really like down to earth. And this idea of the fundamental aspects of virtue being practical are really essential because you can work with them, right? They're manageable. And they're basic to human life. They don't require some philosophical understanding. And these are some questions that you can ask yourself. Do you eat well? Do you sleep well? Do you eliminate your bowels in a healthy manner? Do you have wholesome and healthy relationship to sexuality? Or is it got all sorts of kinkiness? Do you meditate? Do you exercise consistently? Do you have addictions and unhealthy habits that you don't address? Do you complain? Do you complain in order to get attention? Are you reactive or are you responsive? Are you needy or do you try to self-source and then communicate clearly if you do have a true need? Not from a place of neediness, not from a place of pulling from people energetically, but asking for support and help from a place of wholesomeness. Are you negative? Are you a negative person? And if you're a negative person, why? What is it that you are getting out of that negativity? There is a human egoic tendency to complain. And the truth is that when you really get in touch with the fact that your life is a miracle, the fact that you're alive is, the chances of you being alive are impossible. The chance of human life existing on planet Earth is impossible. It required, if you want to talk in scientific terms, the absolute perfect balance of carbon, hydrogen, helium, nitrogen, in insanely perfect and exquisite balance, along with all these other elements, developing in this totally magical way. It is actually magical to get consciousness to evolve to the point of human beings on Zoom having a conversation. It's just batty. But we're not in touch with the fact that it's a miracle that we exist every moment of every day. And so, if you watch a group, we have no right to complain. That is my point. And if you watch a group of people, it depends on the level of consciousness of the group. But more often than not, like the next time you go home for the holidays, and all the aunts and uncles and everybody's together. Just try to be quiet inside and observe what happens. It usually is within 15 to 20 minutes. I'm just making this up, but of everybody getting together, the people start complaining. And it's complaining about the politics, and it's complaining about this, and it's complaining the weather is just a little too hot, or it's a little too cold, or it's a little too this, and the food's a little bit too that, not enough this, too much salt. This tendency towards complaining and inner negativity, inner dialogue, is a place around people which people connect. And you'll notice if you become the voice of positivity in the conversation, you're the weirdo, which is itself bizarre. You know, if you're trying to lift the energy and you're trying to invite the cultivation of virtue into group dynamics, you become the weirdo because it's a lot easier to complain and to rest in negativity. That is an odd thing to observe. And the more you're aware of it, the more you realize there is a cultural baseline that is oriented towards death. I'm going to save that for another conversation, but in terms of food, in terms of practice, in terms of how our attention is used, in terms of how marketing agencies and ad agencies and social media preys on our feeling deficient and incomplete and fragmented to try to give us more of a sense of identity and feeding on negativity. If everybody realized how little they actually need, how they're already whole and complete in their own way, and that this life is really about exploring and understanding who they are and what they're capable of, and that this cultivation of positivity is available, and that the foundation of virtue, talking about virtue as a lofty spiritual idea, is putting the cart before the horse. If your answer to all those questions was, no, my diet isn't great, my sleep is not great, my relationships are not healthy, I've got all sorts of unresolved shit with my mom or my child or my cousin, and we're avoiding it. And I don't meditate, I don't really exercise. If you can't answer all those questions and say the foundations of health are not in place, my relationships are not healthy, start there. That's where the beginning of virtue is. It's the beginning of that path. Once that sound foundation is there, now you have a foundation for working on the next level of inner development and growth. And from that place, you have a strong platform so that cultivating virtue isn't lopsided. It can actually develop in a wholesome and healing and powerful way. We have to have that foundation of a sensible, healthy lifestyle in order to move forward in higher levels of spiritual cultivation. So that was a mouthful. I hope some of what I just shared and all of that was valuable or insightful or in some way beneficial. Maybe a lot of it seems very obvious, and if it does, then great, that's a good thing. And you know, if there are more questions, then we can talk more now. And also, you know, I do meet with people independently, and if that's something that's of interest to you, then feel free to reach out or send an email or something. I think that's all that I want to share this evening. And I also wanted to mention I'm drinking a tea called Shaman's Drum, which we let people know that about a week ago. This is an incredibly special and beautiful tea. People always ask, what tea are we drinking? So I'll just share with you, it's one of my favorite Shopur teas. I drink it in the afternoon and evening because it's quite calming and mellow, and I find that it helps facilitate meditation and restful sleep. It's been aged since the late 80s. So to find a tea from the late 80s that hasn't been blended with other teas of a clean Shopur is quite rare. It's quite a beautiful tea. Someday we will run out, but right now we have a little bit left. And I really love this tea as a tea for facilitating meditation because I find it to be quite a deep tea. It's very calming in the body. And it has a quality of something we call yin wei, which is a mellow smoothness. It really fills the whole mouth, and it's very comforting. I describe it as a walk in an old growth forest because that's kind of what it feels like to me. So if you're looking for teas to facilitate meditation, teas like shaman's drum are very, very beneficial for that. And I'm hosting meditations every Thursday morning. So if you ever want to join us on Thursday mornings at 8:30 a.m. Mountain Standard Time for meditation, we love to sit with everybody. And there's something powerful that happens when people sit as a group together. So, okay. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you so much, everybody, for being here and for taking interest in these ideas. I hope they're helpful. And if anybody has any questions, you're more than welcome to answer or ask. Just unmute yourself and feel free.
I don't have a question, but I have a really cool kind of story to share. I was out for a hike right before this, and I live in New Mexico. And it's just this beautiful hike, beautiful storm rolling in over the mesas. And I brought some of the shaman's drum to try just out in the woods, not knowing kind of that expression about it. And as I was sitting there pouring it for the first time, and I'm in my first year of tea practice, so I'm still really focused on my, getting some of the ritual right. And I was sitting there and just released into, it's just more important about the experience than the practical at this phase, because I'm not, trying to do it for anyone else. I'm trying to just get the basics for myself. And right then, as I was thinking about just shaman's drum and just trying to taste it and just kind of calm myself into the moment, this drummer, which is very New Mexico, this drummer out on this mesa, like 3 mesas over, and I could just see his like silhouette just started drumming this beautiful round drum right as I was tasting it for the first time. And it was just super magical. So you couldn't have timed that better. So I just wanted to share that. It was pretty cool.
Yeah, amazing. That's so cool. You were in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, exactly. As I feel tonight too. So thank you so much.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Allie.
Yeah. Hey, my name's Timo.
Hi, Timo.
How do you like to be addressed?
Colin.
Colin. I think I first stumbled across, you were on a Rich Roll podcast?
Yeah, I've done, Rich and his wife are dear friends of mine, so I've traveled with them on their retreats, and I've done a couple podcasts with them, yeah.
Yeah, right. So I was living in Austin at the time, and I too am in New Mexico.
Were you playing a drum today on one of the mesas?
No, but I have. I'm down in Albuquerque now, but I was up in northern New Mexico for a while. I helped start the Tao of Tea in Portland, Oregon.
Oh, cool.
Ago.
Yeah.
So I'm a number of years into this, and I've been tracking you over your moves and interviews and a lot of affirmations, because I'm in, to break my anonymity, I'm in a Buddhist recovery training program with Dave and Shannon, who live up in Dave Smith of the Buddhist recovery program that he started, and they live in Colorado.
Cool.
And so our last topic was equanimity. And prior to that, I was listening to this podcast as I was having a puer that a friend sent me, and it was about what is mindfulness. I think it was Adyashanti, and he's kind of dropped a lot of his top-heavy dialogue, and it was just like, it's like having a mindful, really top-grade tea, and the sincerity that goes along with that. And it was just, as you went down the list, I was like, I've been out working in my garden. Um, I've been training. I'm going to be 60, and I'm training for seniors triathlon. Um, and I would like to know, in addition to the shaman's dream, um, what else? What other puers right now are you digging?
Excuse me. We have a visitor. So what was the question? What other puers am I enjoying or preferring or?
Yeah, what's up? Because I live right at the base of the Sandias, and I have a meditation garden that I've built. And so every morning at sunrise, I go out to greet this with this puer cake that I got from a friend. It's a tongue ting cake.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's like an 8-year-old. And it's just really, it puts my feet on the earth. You know, I'm like at 5,000 feet, and sun's coming up, and it's like. So, any recommendations you might have, and also your email to like connect with you, possibly one-on-one.
Sure. The so you can email me at these dogs didn't get out today, so they're like, this is cruel, unusual punishment. We're gonna go in a little bit. You can email me livingteas, TEAS at Gmail. And I check that every day, so I can respond to you there. And I'll also kind of look at what teas we currently have to make some maybe specific recommendations. But if you're looking for teas that are very grounding, we're starting to move into the spring season, spring and summer. So I start to shift the teas that I'm drinking. I really drink teas seasonally. And we have something called the Seasonal Tea Club, where every 3 months we send out 3 to 5 teas. We're sending 4 at the end of this month. And I do a write-up, a long write-up on a particular topic.
Okay.
And I talk a lot about those teas and why they're seasonally appropriate.
Cool.
And I just say that because at this time of year, I start to drink younger shungpur, what we call green shungpur.
Yeah. I got a brick also with that. It's aged. It's like I got to use a pair of pliers to break a piece of it off.
Yep.
And it's the antithesis to the darker tongue ting puer that cake that he sent me. They're like complete opposite teas, even though they're both puers. And I was like, that's what I'm sipping on now.
Yeah, a lot of that. I mean,
kinda
that's from the
green,
aging
it's
process.
Yeah, it's got a much more green nectar to it than, say, the Tang Ting, which is much darker, much earthier. But
Yeah.
it's still equally grounding.
Yeah, my recommendation, kind of offhand, and like I said, I'll respond more in an email. But I would start to transition towards a little bit lighter puer teas. But if you still want the
Right.
depth and the darkness of a tea,
Yeah.
I'd recommend some mid-aged shungpur. Like we have some like petrichor and soma, and petrichor, soma in the shungpur. In the shopur, I would recommend like samadhi. Satori is a really special tea. Eye of the Storm is one of my absolute favorite, really dark shopurs. Eye of the Storm is quite a specialty. And but again, at this time of year, I start to transition more into roasted oolongs and younger puer. And as we move into the warmer months, into green teas and white teas and lighter. Sometimes I drink lighter red teas in the summer. Or if you want to drink a dark tea in the hotter months, I recommend a tea called Liobao, which is a true black tea because it's actually, even though it's very dark, it's cooling in the body. And we have 2 Liubaos right now. One of them is very expensive and very special and rare, and the other one is a lot more accessible price-wise, but it's still a very, very nice Liubao tea. So,
those are on your site?
yeah, so I might recommend if you want a tea that's cooling in the body for the changing seasons, but it's still really dark and earthy, try Quiet Before the Dawn, which is a dark Liu tea.
Cool.
And like I said, if you send me an email, I'll go and look and see what we have and make some recommendations based on that.
You're in Boulder?
I'm up in Telluride, Colorado, actually.
Telluride.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah, I was up in Leadville for a while with a friend. Did the Leadville 100.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to also thank you for your little expose. I lived in Greece for 5 years, and there's a friend, Shakti, who's on this site that I've worked as a chef at a restaurant in.
Hi, Timo. Hi, Timo. I haven't seen you in it's been 7 years.
Yeah.
Total coincidence.
Yeah, I worked as a chef at a restaurant called Avocado in Syntagma Square in Greece, vegetarian cafe. So and I did get a chance to go to Alexandria, Egypt, and also I traveled throughout Greece. So thanks so much. It was an awesome session. A lot of affirmations in there. And I appreciate your sharing and all your knowledge. So
Thanks, Timo. Appreciate it.
thank you. Yeah, I'll send you an email.
All right. Well, I think if nobody else has any other inquiries, I've got a hard stop. We're at about an hour and a half because I've got to go over to the tea house to help some people there at a private event. Also, I just want to mention we're going to reopen it. We opened a tea house. We spent a year building a tea house, and then last March we were supposed to open. And 3 days before we were supposed to open, COVID broke out, and we still haven't been able to open. So we've had some kind of private parties, and we were open a little bit for outdoor seating and a little bit last summer, but not really. And so it's been a really long year for everybody. I mean, we're all in the same boat. But to put, this tea house is like 10 years in the making. So to get that close and then be like, no, why? It's been kind of a tough year. And also because all of our operating expenses and payroll and all that started in March, we didn't qualify for any of the government grants or anything. And so we've kind of held on. Thankfully, Living Tea and the tea house are still in existence. But we're kind of threading the eye of the needle until we can get open in May. So if anybody feels inspired to get some spring or summer teas, we included a nice discount in the email with the link to this talk. And I'm happy to make any recommendations, like Timo was saying, in an email or something. But I just want to express my gratitude for all the interest and support in the tea business, because without that support, we wouldn't be able to stay in business. And, it's hard to talk to people about doing what they love if I can't do what I love and stay in business. So, a big part of my message is encouraging people to stay true to their heart and stay true to their path, and then trust that the universe will provide for them. So I just want to, personally say thank you to all of you for your support, both in terms of just energetic support, but also support of the business, because it really means a tremendous amount to us, and we just really appreciate all of you. So thank you.
Hey, Colin, I had a quick question for you.
Yeah, hey, Jeff.
It's good to see you. Thank you for sharing everything in such a succinct way. It's really interesting to see the pillars that you described are the same pillars that we work with on our patients on a day-to-day basis. So
oh, wow.
It's really great to see you've organized it in they're the basic tenets of how to live healthy, right? But
yeah,
so many people don't get that kind of teaching. So it's great that you're spreading that message
yeah,
to everyone. So I've done a decent amount of reading of Gurdjieff as well. So that I wanted to ask, the quote that you shared, was that a Gurdjieff quote at the beginning? It sounded like it, but I was just wondering who it was.
That was Jean de Salzman. So the last name is
Salzman. Okay.
Yeah, Salzmann. Jean de Salzman, and she published a book about 6 years ago. I mean, she's passed, but she was Gurdjieff's secretary for about 35, 40 years, and she lived at the Prieuré, which was basically their version of an ashram in France during the 1930s and 40s, and she was at his side for 35, 40 years, and was an extraordinarily cultivated and wise woman in her own right. And the name of the book is The Reality of Being, The Fourth Way of Gurdjieff. And it's a really, really extraordinary book. I've now read it twice. I didn't understand most of it because it's written from somebody at such an advanced level of personal development that it's hard to understand unless one has really worked on themselves profoundly. But I took a tremendous amount both times I've read it, and I think it's after the book In Search of the Miraculous, which is considered kind of the great masterpiece of the Gurdjieff work. I've probably read 20 books out of the work at this point and was in the Gurdjieff work for many years. I find it's probably number 2 or number 3 in terms of importance from the things that I've read. So if that work is really of interest to you, then I really encourage you to explore it. And
I actually have it sitting right on.
Oh, there.
I've been reading it as well, so I thought it sounded familiar.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Thank you.
What was the name of it again?
That book is called The Reality of Being.
Reality of Being? Okay.
Yeah. And, I say to people, if they're curious about the Gurdjieff work, I would start with, there's a book called The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution, which is a series of 5 lectures given by Uspensky, who's one of Gurdjieff's primary students in London back in the 1920s, I think. And that's a succinct book. It's only about 100 pages. The Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution. And if that writing and those ideas really appeal to you, then I would have other suggestions like In Search of the Miraculous, or more importantly, trying to come in contact with a group that's actually in an authentic thread of the Gurdjieff work, because there are a lot of offshoot groups now that I don't feel are connected to the real tradition, but the ones that are connected to the real tradition, it's very profoundly deep work, the Gurdjieff work. So, but it ain't easy, the thing you do for like the first 5 years is really see objectively that you're totally asleep and that you're an asshole. So, again, excuse my language, but that can be quite shocking for a lot of people to see. We all think we're awake and that we're kind and wonderful people. Maybe not all of us, but, seeing all the ways that that's not true can be quite a shock to the system. But that shock can also be sufficient motivation for a deeper level of inner work. So, there are 2 sides of a coin, so there's a yin and yang of everything. So in the shock of seeing your level of sleep and the ways in which you're not conscious of who and how you are, inside of seeing that, there is the seed of real work. So, these things go hand in hand. So, all right. Well, thank you, everyone. Have a happy Saturday night, and have a beautiful Easter. Whatever your religious background, may you treat it as a return of spring, and the longer days, and this is a particularly poignant spring, I think, for so many of us, because this last year is like the longest hibernation ever. So it's an opportunity really to come out and the spring is related to the liver in Chinese medicine, and to the eyes, and to open the eyes, to move the limbs, and to move with the movement of nature, which is everything comes to life. It's the time of greenery returning and of connection, and in nature, that connection would be, mating. I'm not suggesting everybody go out and mate, but I am suggesting that, really connect with people. This time in the world, what everybody needs, I think, more than anything, more than any other kind of healing or spiritual work or anything, is to really connect in an authentic and deep space with other people. And, I encourage you to do that, because springtime is the time for that to happen. So don't get in your own way, and get out there and connect with some human beings. So wishing you all well. Have a beautiful weekend. And thanks for coming tonight. We'll see you soon.